Great. Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to spend with us and to talk about something that's really important, feedback, and looking at strategies for giving our students effective feedback that's timely, specific, and actionable. So before we get started, I'd like to kind of see who's out there today. What's your role, grade, subject, and the chat box is going, so feel free to write at any time, but if you just want to jot down why this topic of feedback is important to you, or maybe what your goal is for this webinar, that would be great. We'll give you a minute to do that. I think the poll should be coming up here soon. There you go. Take a minute to answer that, and then we'll move on. All right, great. So it looks like we have a little heavier on the elementary, and we have some middle as well, and all grade levels, which is great because the area of feedback is universal. It's general, and the strategies and the ideas that I'm going to share with you today really reach all levels, K-12, all subject areas. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and get started. As Heather mentioned, this is recorded, so I just want to give a shout out to all of you listening on the recording. Thank you for doing that as well. And please feel free to reach out as well to me during the webinar to ask any questions. So today we're going to take a look at feedback, in particular three things. How do you build that culture that accepts, and not only accepts, but craves feedback, that wants it? To learn from, to improve from. And what are those appropriate timings for feedback? And what kind of strategies can we use to really provide our students with that specific and actionable feedback to make a difference? So I wanted to start with pulling from, as we know, John Hattie, and the researcher that spent many years gathering over 800 different studies and running through a synthesis of all the student achievement data and putting together the top influencers on student achievement. And one that bubbled up to the top in any type of information you look at from Hattie is feedback. And I just pulled this quote: "The most powerful single modification that enhances achievement is feedback." And recently I took a look at his book, and this is a newer book, The Visible Learning Feedback, that he wrote based upon all the research he had done, and kind of took some of those strategies and ideas, and I'm going to share those from that with you today as well. When we think about feedback, we get feedback every day. We give feedback, we get feedback, personally, professionally. But really reflecting on it, is that feedback effective? My children love to give me feedback on my cooking. They love to give me feedback on my driving. So there's a lot of feedback that I get on a daily basis, and we all do. But it's what we do with it that really matters. And that's what we want to do with it. We want to give our students feedback that matters. And so to do that, we need to create a classroom culture that promotes risk-taking and really allows the students to learn from their mistakes, and not only just learn from them, but to celebrate them, to want them, and to grow from them. So the first step is building a feedback-friendly culture, and there's really two parts to that. And the first part is to create a mistake-friendly culture, where students are not afraid to take a chance. They're not afraid to put themselves out there, that they're okay with things that don't work out the way that they expect them to, and that they celebrate that. And so I just threw in the ever-optimist Bob Ross, and how everything is a wonderful or happy accident. And even though his happy accidents turn into these beautiful works of art, he has a very good point, is that really looking at it as this is an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to learn from. And so some strategies I want to share with you to create that mistake-friendly culture, things that I've used in my classroom is we would call these failure Fridays. And it wouldn't be necessarily every Friday, but maybe every other week or once a month. And we'd share stories of success out of failures from those people that my students were very familiar with or identified with. And so here's just a few examples, and there are so many out there. But just talking about that, having those discussions and realizing the importance of taking risks, making mistakes, being brave over being perfect. That's actually a book I'm reading right now, which is really good, and that's just a statement that resonates with me, and I really try to emulate that with my students. Another strategy to build that risk-taking environment is that I tried, I failed, I learned. And this is a great way to model this for your students. And I would do this a lot, bringing in things in my life that I was working on, and golf was a big one. It still is, and it's still an area of growth for me. And also my cooking, my baking. And the more that we can model that for our students and provide that safe place where they can share those experiences well, whether it's they're talking about it in class or they're journaling, the better. So find those opportunities to model that for your students, bring those in, have them reflect on those things as well, and use that STEM to help them gather their thoughts. So I tried, I failed, I learned. And kind of along the same lines, we have this journaling opportunity that we call my wonderful mistake. So when students are reflecting on their learning experience, whether it's an investigation or the lesson that you're working on with your students, and you're having your students reflect and construct a meaning from that experience, I always include what was your wonderful mistake? What did you learn from? And how are you going to use that learning to move forward, or the quote, the fail forward type of thing. So having students reflect on that and taking that a step further is, as students get more comfortable in your class and the culture, to share those mistakes and talk about them and have the class vote on a mistake of the week and make it a big deal. Put it on a board and and just really celebrate the wonders and learnings from mistakes. Because when you set that groundwork, then giving the students feedback or students receiving feedback from peers, it's just going to be so much easier for them to accept and to use. So I want to kind of turn it over to you and find out if there are any strategies that you use to create a mistake-friendly or risk-taking environment of your classroom. So the chat box is there, so if there's anything you want to share, go ahead and do that now. Maybe I'll wait a few seconds here to see if got anything to share, and then we'll move on. All right, so we'll leave the chat box open, so if you have any ideas, please feel free to put those up there. But one thing that came to my mind, and it's more kind of maybe an impossible question or an impossible task where you challenge your students with, and maybe you pin up a $20 bill in the front of your classroom, and you kind of give them this impossible task that they're learning from, and they're maybe making mistakes or errors on it, but they're continuing to learn, and it's also an engager as well. So I've seen that done in classrooms too. Okay, so creating a mistake-friendly classroom, providing those supports for the students so that they're accepting and wanting feedback, that's the first step. The second step is, well, in order for students to take and use feedback, they need to know where they're going. They need to understand where they're at and where they need to be. And that is where clear learning targets and success criteria come in, so establishing those. And just as a review, I know learning targets are very familiar to most of us, and just a couple of things to remind ourselves about learning targets, helping our students have some clarity on what it is they need to know and be able to do, that the learning targets are not learning objectives, which learning objectives are your state standards, written very academically, very vague. They can be very broad as well, and not very meaningful to students. So turning those learning objectives into specific, clear, student-friendly language. Secondly is learning targets aren't agenda items. So agendas are very helpful. I know that they help me keep on track of what I need to be doing for that hour or that day, but they're not the learning targets. The learning targets are posted somewhere else in your classroom. And lastly, just making those learning targets the norm, making that intentional, sharing those learning targets with the students at the beginning of the lesson and referring back to it throughout, and allowing the students opportunity to assess themselves, to receive feedback, to be able to to fix it up, to iterate, and then always linking those learning targets to your formative and summative assessments. They're just part of the seamless part of your instruction. And then building off the learning targets is really being clear on the success criteria. So students know what their goal is, right? They're clear on their target, but they also need to be clear on what success looks like and how will they show their success. So how do they know if they've met their goal? And what is that end product to be? Is it a project that they're going to show their success? Is it a paper? Is it a performance? Is it a PSA? Or is it a test? So how is it that they will show their success in their learning? Once they have clarity on that, any feedback that they're given is going to be useful for them because they'll know what to do with it. They have context. And just a reminder, success should never be a secret. Okay, so building that feedback-friendly classroom is the foundational first step into being able to now provide our students with effective, both timely and actionable feedback. So let's talk about timing of feedback. And usually when you think of feedback as immediate. You want to be able to talk to the student, give that student right, so they're not going down the wrong path, so we can kind of recorrect them. But in John Hattie's work, he mentions that just kind of hold off sometimes depending upon the level of your student or the level of learning. So if your student is struggling and needs a little bit more scaffolding or support from you, immediate feedback is more appropriate. They have context. It's not going to be forgotten. They're not going to get frustrated. They're going to have a direction to move forward. Where your more advanced students, delay that feedback a little bit, because if you're confirming or affirming their work, then they think their work stops. Well, I'm done. I finished it. It looks good. Allow them time to really look at it and to assess themselves and possibly find areas where they can improve themselves, and holding off on that feedback for those students. Secondly, in the level of learning is if you are on a concept or a topic and your students are just at that surface level of learning, on the Bloom taxonomy, the remember and understand types of levels, maybe give them that immediate feedback to help them, to keep them moving forward so they can move up to the higher orders of thinking on Bloom's taxonomy. Now, if they're at that create or evaluate level, they're a deeper level, then delay it a little bit. They're the place where they can look at things, assess them themselves, and figure out how they need to make improvements. So even though feedback a lot of times is immediate, it doesn't always have to be, depending upon the level of your student and the level of the learning they're at. So if you think about three things for feedback. Here's kind of your the definition of effective feedback. It needs to be timely, which could depending upon the level of your student or the level of their learning. The feedback needs to be specific, and it needs to be actionable. So we talked about timely, so let's take a look at specific and actionable and what that means and some strategies we can do to provide that feedback. So first, effective feedback focuses on the specific qualities of the work and not the person. And it's really easy to give praise, and praise is an incredible relationship builder. It's great at developing rapport, but it's really not effective feedback because there's no actionable step. Good job, or you did great on this, or you're great at math, or you're great at science. It's a very nice thing to say, but it's not giving them any idea of improvement or any next steps or helping to grow them as a learner. So when we're talking about specific and actionable feedback, we're talking about feedback that focuses on the work and not the person. And grades and comments with no focus on improvement are not actionable. So I remember getting papers back, in my school days a long time ago with all the edits done for me. And then all I would do was then just take those edits and make them. There was no learning involved in there. I just took those suggestions, those edits, and put them in. I didn't have to think through that myself. The teacher had corrected the work for me. And a lot of times it's really easy for us or hard for us not to go in and make those edits ourselves. But just hold off on that and look at the student's work and really look to see what are those areas of improvement that you can generalize, that you can talk to the student about, whether it's you have an actual conversation or it's a note you write on their work, so that they have direction and then they're making those improvements themselves. And lastly, which is crucial, and I would argue the most important thing, is allowing students that time to fix it up. That's that actionable piece. That not only are we giving them specific feedback, areas for improvement, and the next steps, but we're giving them time to implement that feedback. And I know how difficult it is to do that, but it's incredibly important for them to see that process. And this is where the real learning happens. And so to give you an example of that, in one of our Blue Apple projects, it's a PBL unit, 50 years of interest. We have fifth graders learn the importance of financial literacy. And so they learn about the powers of investing and saving and the devastation of debt. And while they're learning that, they're challenged to develop a lesson that then they share with high school students on financial literacy. And so we put in a whole time opportunity for them to fix it up. And we introduce that to them, the power of feedback and iteration through this paper challenge. So we give the students a sheet of computer paper, and we give them 2 minutes, and we say, build the tallest freestanding tower you can in 2 minutes with just using that piece of paper, like you'd see in that picture. And then after 2 minutes, we look around, we do some measurements, and then we talk about it. Say, okay, so what if I'd given you another 2 minutes to make changes, and then we measured it? How powerful would that be? How do you think your tower, how the height of your tower would change? What would you do differently? And just talking about the importance of getting feedback, assessing, self-assessing, using that information, looking around the room, what other groups are doing too, using that information to make it better, to improve that iteration piece, what engineers do all the time, and how important that is for students to do that as well. So we give them time to fix it up. So before they share their engaging lessons on financial literacy with their high school friends, they have the opportunity to share their lessons with people with groups in their class, and then possibly, if we're able to, also with other classes, so they can get all that feedback before they share that with those high school students and use that feedback to fix it up. And it's just an example of just showing students the power of iteration and the importance of reflecting on that feedback to make things better. Okay, so strategies. So I'm going to go through a few strategies for specific and actionable feedback. Here. So this is a very simple one. I really like this because it keeps you focused. Similar to if you're familiar with the sandwich strategy, for giving feedback, where you start with a positive comment. The middle is your constructive feedback, and the bottom of the sandwich is another positive comment. So it's very similar to that, but I really like how it's structured. So you positively identify a strength. You're explicit. You give specific, concrete suggestions for improvement, and you help identify next steps. So, for example, if I was looking at work from a student in my earth science class, I would talk to them about, you really understand how igneous rocks relate to the rock cycle. But what's missing here is how metamorphism ties into the rock cycle. So what do you need to help you get to that next step? And so talking through that. So very quick conversation, and very easy for the teacher and the student then to work through and identify what are those next steps that student needs to improve on their work. And if you notice, it says help them identify. Not giving them, this is what you need to do, but helping them find those next steps. And the next one I like as well. It's a very similar construct. It's the ABC strategy. I agree with this part of your work. I would like you to build upon this, and I challenge you to take it to this next step. So very similar to the PEN strategy. And lastly, I'll share with one that we're familiar with, but logistically this can be a challenge. But it is the most powerful form of feedback a teacher can give a student, is a one-on-one conferencing. And that could be done as you're circulating the room and you're able to pull a student aside, so you have to go out into the hall. Now, if you teach high school or middle school and you have 150 students, that becomes logistically challenging. And so maybe putting it on a scheduled, rotating basis, trying to hit each student maybe once a week, whatever works with your calendar. Or maybe they're doing collaborative work and you're doing more one-on-one conferencing, but you're doing that within a group too. So making it work for you. But as you're talking to the student about their work, asking them more mediative thinking types of questions. And, what do you mean by? Or tell me more about this. Or how could you change this to make this clearer? What steps would you take? And having those conversations not only gives them guidance and direction as to move forward without giving them the answer, but it also shows them that you care. You took that time to talk to them about their work, and you're building that rapport and those relationships with your students. So those were a few of the strategies I shared with you. We started off with how to build that mistake-friendly, feedback-friendly culture, some strategies for that, and then ended with some actionable and specific feedback strategies. So I believe you're going to see a poll up here. So I'm curious to find out which strategies might you try with your students, and are there any other strategies or tips or tricks that you have that would help us out? It's great, wonderful. Looks like everyone's willing to give something a try there. And the mistake of the week and failure, those were some of my favorite ones. And the more you can bring that into your students, the more you're going to build that foundation of risk-taking in your classroom, and it's just going to be primed for effective feedback. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. And let's see here. We have just one last thing I wanted to share with you here before I turn things back over to Heather. But here are some additional resources. And again, you'll get this emailed out to you with these links. But I wanted to share with you some of the work on feedback from Edutopia, AESCD. There's a great book by Susan Brookhart on effective feedback. Also John Hattie's book, Visible Learning Feedback. And if you're interested, also have a feedback strategies document there. And check out blueappleteacher.org. That's where you'll see all those projects, and in particular that 50 Years of Interest project I shared with you about financial literacy is there as well. So feel free to take a look at those. And thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I'm going to turn things over to Heather. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Dawn. That was great. Before we go, I just wanted to highlight a couple of upcoming events that you might be interested in. First, we have Science on the Grand, our STEAM conference for inquiry-based learning. That's coming this summer at July 13th and 14th. So for more information, you can check out that link in the web links box. And also, we have another webinar next month on March 8th, where we're going to talk about authenticity in PBL. So you can register for that as well in the web links box. And don't forget to go to blueappleteacher.org. we are offering 20% off any PBL project with the coupon code webinar20. There's a lot of great projects in there, including that project that Don talked about earlier, 50 Years of Interest. I personally saw that project in action in the classroom and saw students really engaged and loved teaching their lessons to the high schoolers.
Yeah.
So check those out, and thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Have a great night.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye.